Imagine you're struggling, really struggling to make ends meet, and someone, out of the blue, offers you a chance at a better life. A way to escape poverty. Sounds pretty good, right? But what if that opportunity leads you into a legal battle that sparks a nationwide debate about exploitation? That's exactly what happened in the Supreme Court case right here in the Philippines. That really captivated the nation. It was huge.
Yeah, this case really did force people to confront, I guess, some uncomfortable truths about how poverty and the desire for a better life can make people vulnerable, especially here.
We're diving into the story of Candy, also known as Baby or Jillian Muring Ferrer, and Nikki, also known as Demi Jamot or Nikki Muring Ferrer. They were accused of, well, some very serious crimes.
Yeah, really serious.
Related to human trafficking.
This case was decided on July 6, 2022.
So let's get into the specifics. Candy and Nikki were accused of violating the Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act of 2003, specifically Section 4A, in relation to Section 6A and C. I mean, that's some serious legal language.
It is.
What does it actually mean?
Basically, in simpler terms, they were accused of recruiting and transporting 9 individuals, including 7 minors, from Cagayan de Oro to Cebu for the purpose of exploitation.
Wow, 7 minors. To understand this better, we need to hear from those involved. The prosecution presented testimonies from 3 of the minor victims, who, of course, for their protection, were identified in the court documents as Perrier 223042, BBB 223042, and CCC 223042. Their accounts are, well, they're pretty disturbing.
They are.
So the victims testified that they were working as dancers in Cagayan de Oro when Candy and Nikki approached them, promising them, bigger money. If they worked in a bar in Cebu, they even used this term bar fines. What does that even mean?
Bar fines essentially meant that customers could pay a fee to take the girls out of the bar, often for, for exploitative purposes.
So it wasn't just a vague promise of a better job?
No, not at all. The victim said that Candy and Nikki took a very active role in organizing their travel, buying their tickets, paying their fares, and even accompanying them to Cebu. They were, believe it or not, they were even coached on what to say if questioned by authorities.
It's a really stark example of how traffickers can manipulate and control their victims.
It is.
It sounds like the prosecution built a pretty strong case. What did Candy and Nikki have to say in their defense?
Well, their story, it adds another layer of complexity to this case. Candy and Nikki claimed that they were victims themselves, that they were forced into prostitution, and that they were simply trying to help the others, find better opportunities.
So they insisted they were just facilitating travel for people who wanted to go to Cebu.
Yeah, and that no actual prostitution took place.
So it's a classic he said, she said situation.
Yeah.
How did the lower courts navigate these conflicting narratives?
Well, the trial court in Cagayan de Oro sided with the prosecution, finding Candy and Nikki guilty of qualified trafficking in persons. The sentence was severe: life imprisonment and a fine of P2,000 each.
Wow, that's a heavy sentence. Did they appeal the decision?
Of course they appealed. They took the case to the Court of Appeals, hoping for, a different outcome.
And what happened there?
The Court of Appeals, they reviewed everything, the evidence and arguments. Ultimately, they upheld the trial court's decision, confirming the guilty verdict.
So both the trial court and the Court of Appeals agreed. This must have been a pretty clear-cut case.
Not necessarily. It's important to remember that the Court of Appeals made a key point in their ruling. They emphasized that under the Philippine Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act, actual prostitution doesn't have to occur for trafficking to be proven. The potential for exploitation, the act of recruitment and transportation for that purpose is enough to establish the crime.
So the focus is on the intent and actions of the accused, not just the outcome.
Right.
But this case didn't end there, did it? Candy and Nikki took their case all the way to the Supreme Court.
They did. They filed 2 separate petitions for review, hoping to overturn the lower court's decisions. These petitions, GR number 223042 and GR number 223769, were consolidated by the Supreme Court, and it became a landmark case, raising crucial questions about consent, exploitation, and vulnerability in the context of human trafficking.
The Supreme Court had a lot to unpack here.
Oh yeah, a lot.
So in part 2 of this deep dive, we'll examine the Supreme Court's reasoning, their analysis of the evidence, and how they ultimately decided the fate of Candy and Nikki.
We'll also explore the broader implications of their ruling for future trafficking cases in the Philippines, and what this case tells us about the ongoing fight against this complex issue.
It's a big one.
It is. Welcome back to the deep dive. We're picking up right where we left off, Dissecting this Supreme Court case involving Candy and Nikki, it really raises so many questions about those gray areas of human trafficking.
Yeah, we left off with Candy and Nikki appealing their case to the Supreme Court after both the trial court and the Court of Appeals found them guilty. It's like they were throwing everything they had at the legal system,
They were,
hoping something would stick.
yeah, they raised some interesting points. For instance, they argued that the information filed against them was vague because it didn't specify like the exact parts of the law they supposedly broke.
Sounds like a technicality. Did the Supreme Court think it held any weight?
Not really. The Supreme Court actually reminded everyone that the law against human trafficking has two main sections. Section 3A provides a general definition of what trafficking is, while sections 4 and 5 lay out the specific punishable acts, like recruitment, transportation, and harboring individuals for exploitation.
So it wasn't about getting bogged down in legal jargon. It was about looking at the substance of the crime itself.
Exactly.
And the Supreme Court felt the evidence in this case was pretty clear.
Yeah, they analyzed the testimonies of those 3 minor victims.
Yeah.
And what they found was, wow, it was troubling.
Those young girls, lured with promises of bigger money,
Right.
coached on what to tell authorities, given very specific details about the work in Cebu. It all just hints very strongly at exploitation.
It does.
We talked before about the idea of bar fines, which honestly sounds pretty predatory in itself. I imagine the victims' testimonies painted a pretty grim picture of what awaited them in Cebu.
Oh, they did. And the Supreme Court really, they didn't shy away from addressing the issue of age and vulnerability.
Right.
Remember, the defense argued that the girls went to Cebu willingly, but the court made it clear that consent, especially for minors, isn't always so straightforward.
That makes sense. I mean, it's hard to imagine a 16-year-old fully grasping the potential consequences of such a decision, especially when faced with economic hardship.
Exactly. The court recognized that poverty and the allure of a better life,
Yeah.
can really create a situation where individuals, especially young people, are more susceptible to manipulation and exploitation.
Yeah.
They don't always have the same capacity to make informed choices as adults
Mhm.
who aren't facing those same pressures.
Right, right. But what about Candy and Nikki's claim that they were also victims of trafficking? Didn't they argue that their past experiences should be taken into account?
They did, and the court acknowledged the tragic reality that sometimes victims of exploitation end up becoming exploiters themselves. It's a heartbreaking cycle.
It's like the trauma of their own experience somehow warped their sense of right and wrong.
Yeah. But the court was firm in its stance, even if Candy and Nikki had been victims in the past. It didn't excuse their actions in this case. They were still responsible for their role in trafficking others. It's a complicated issue, no doubt.
It makes you think about the responsibility of the legal system, too,
Mm.
to both protect victims and hold perpetrators accountable, even when those lines become blurred. And this case also brought up an interesting point about the evolution of the law itself. The defense tried to argue that because no prostitution actually took place, Candy and Nikki should only be charged with attempted trafficking, which wasn't a crime in the Philippines at the time of the offense.
Right.
So they were trying to use a loophole in the law to their advantage.
In a way, yes. But the Supreme Court, they shut that argument down. They pointed out that under the law as it stood in 2008, recruiting and transporting individuals for the purpose of exploitation was enough to constitute the crime of trafficking. The intent and the actions were clear, even if the intended exploitation hadn't yet taken place.
So they were saying you don't have to wait for the worst case scenario to play out to take action
Exactly.
against traffickers.
And to clarify things further, they even addressed a newer law, RA 10364, which was enacted in 2013, and introduced the concept of attempted trafficking as a specific crime.
So they were acknowledging that the legal landscape had shifted.
Yes. But they emphasized that this newer law didn't change the fact that Candy and Nikki's actions were already illegal under the 2003 law. They had crossed the line, regardless of whether the exploitation had fully manifested or not.
Seems like the Supreme Court was very thorough in their analysis, leaving no stone unturned.
They were.
Yeah.
And their decision in this case, as we'll see in part 3 of this deep dive, had a significant impact on how trafficking cases are handled in the Philippines, sending a strong message about the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals and holding exploiters accountable, regardless of their past experiences.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into this incredibly complex Supreme Court case. It's been a journey, hasn't it? From the accusations to the lower court rulings, all the way to the Supreme Court's analysis. We've really unpacked a lot. But it all comes down to this. What happened to Candy and Nikki in the end?
Well, the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the lower court's decisions, finding both Candy and Nikki guilty of qualified trafficking in persons.
And as we mentioned before, the penalties for that are, well, they're pretty serious.
Yeah, they are.
We're talking life imprisonment for each of them, right?
That's right, a life sentence for each of them. And to really emphasize the severity of the crime, the court also upheld the P2 Mills fine that was imposed by the lower courts.
2 million pesos. It's a stark reminder that the Philippines takes human trafficking incredibly seriously.
Yeah, it does.
It's a hefty price to pay, both in terms of freedom and finances. But the punishment didn't stop there, did it? I remember reading something about moral and exemplary damages. What are those exactly?
Oh, that's a good point. You see, the court didn't just focus on punishing Candy and Nikki. They also wanted to address the harm that was done to the victims. Moral damages are meant to, compensate victims for the emotional and psychological suffering they've endured.
So it's about acknowledging the trauma they experienced,
Right.
the fear, the anxiety, maybe even the long-term impact of being trafficked, especially as minors.
And the court took all of that into consideration when they awarded each of the victims P500,000.
Yeah.
In moral damages. It's a way of saying, we see your pain and we're going to hold those responsible accountable for it.
Right.
And what about the exemplary damages? What purpose do those serve?
Well, exemplary damages, they have a slightly different goal. They're not just about compensating the victims, they're also about deterring future offenses.
Okay.
The court wanted to send a clear message, not just to Candy and Nikki, but to anyone who might even consider engaging in human trafficking. If you exploit others, there will be serious consequences, not just for you, but also for your wallet.
So it's like a double whammy, punishing
Yeah.
the crime itself and setting an example to prevent others from following the same path. This whole case has been, well, a roller coaster of emotions. It's heartbreaking to think about what these young girls went through, being lured by those false promises and caught up in this web of exploitation. But it's also encouraging to see the legal system working to protect them, to hold those responsible accountable, and to clarify the law in a way that makes it harder for traffickers to slip through the cracks.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. The Candy and Nikki Ferrer case is about so much more than just two individuals. It's about shining a light on the dark underbelly of exploitation, about confronting the complexities of consent, and about reaffirming society's commitment to justice.
This deep dive started with a single story, but it's led us to explore so many important issues. Poverty, vulnerability, the allure of a better life, the manipulation tactics of traffickers, and the evolution of the law itself. It's a lot to process.
It is, and what's particularly striking is how the Supreme Court used this case. To clarify some key points about Philippine law on trafficking, their decision set a precedent for future cases, emphasizing that even if the intended exploitation doesn't actually happen, the act of recruitment and transportation for that purpose is still a crime. And they didn't shy away from acknowledging the unique vulnerabilities of minors and the need to carefully scrutinize situations where consent might be, coerced or influenced by desperation.
It's a powerful message, one that will hopefully resonate beyond the courtroom. This case has been a sobering reminder that human trafficking isn't some distant problem. It's happening right here, right now in our communities. It's a call to action for all of us to be more aware of the signs, to challenge our own assumptions about consent, and to support organizations that are working tirelessly to combat this crime. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I'd love to hear from you, our listeners. What are your thoughts on this case? Did anything surprise you? What stood out to you as the most important takeaway? Share your reactions in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more insightful explorations of complex issues that matter. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep striving for a more just and equitable world.